that the way to keep a man is to be sexual, even when they're not comfortable being sexual. You're more likely to be drug addicts, more likely to be addicted to video games, more likely to die from overdose. And so the cost financially to me was, maybe $20 million. Marriages often fell apart because telomeres are, when you're about 9.5 years of age, the more likely you are to live longer. They're the single biggest predictor of the length of your life. She cried and said, how sad she was that she had never pursued her own career. Men had to be to give up what they wanted to do the things that they needed to do. The feminist movement is that it has evolved into honing victimhood as a fine art.
Dr. Warren Farrell, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I think it's a real privilege and an honor to get time with you. So thank you so much. And happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you very much.
I want to talk about the Bowie crisis, but first I want to ask you what your career and your life is fascinating. Particularly your work in the 1970s as part of the feminist movement. You've been elected to the board, the National Organization of Women, 3 times. Tell me about that. Tell me about what drew you to activism. What drew you to feminism in particular?
I think when the feminist movement surfaced, I immediately saw that there were women in my class that were, brighter than I was, and that were not being encouraged to, sort of to pursue anything besides, being a nurse or a teacher or a homemaker, and all of which are really good professions. But, some of them, one of them was especially good in science, and another one was, they had real potential. They could have been, presidents of the United States without anybody thinking that there was anything wrong with their selection. And then there was my mother she had been given a scholarship to Cornell, but it was a small one, and she couldn't afford it, and so she thought that it would be better for her to attract men by being able to dress well and keep herself physically well. And so she gave up something that she really, that later regretted when I was going for my PhD. She cried and said, how sad she was that she had never pursued her own career. I saw my sister oftentimes having interest in men that didn't sort of, different men than the ones that were interested in her, and didn't have the sort of feel like there was permission for her to say, I'd like to go out with you, could et cetera. And I thought that was, that's ridiculous. I didn't know at that time, that a happy wife is a happy life. And so therefore, it's really important that women have their choice as to who they would like to go out with, because it is true that oftentimes when a woman is happy, a man is usually happy. But when a man is happy, that doesn't necessarily mean that the woman is happy. And so so all those things drew me. And I wanted women to be as powerful as they could be, empowered, and to be able to choose to do what they wanted to do when they wanted to do it within the framework of other people, considerations of other people. So the feminist movement represented all of that to me. Yes, it was man bashing right from the beginning. But I thought that would be sort of temporary and would sort of fade out. I didn't realize it was going to become a very that I was wanting women to not be victims. And what I'm sad about the feminist movement is that it has evolved into honing victimhood as a fine art. And to me, there is power in being able to sell yourself as a victim. But victim power does not create respect. It creates a type of, maybe I'll get more scholarships allotted to me. Maybe I'll have more people give me more money. Maybe there'll be special programs for me. Yes, it gives you certain types of privileges when you portray yourself effectively as a victim, which women have done, especially feminist women have done. But it doesn't help relationships, and it doesn't help respect for the women who hone victimhood as a fine art. And that began to, and then increasingly, the feminist movement was built on the backs of the civil rights movement, and civil rights movement in the United States clearly had oppressors and oppressed. And no one needs to explain that. But many of the early feminists were quite Marxist in their orientation, and they felt people who earned more money were the oppressors and people who earned less money were the oppressed. And since men in general earned more money, it made logical sense to the feminists and myself that they must be not the oppressors necessarily. I never thought that, but many of the feminists did feel that because they felt that the men earning more money was part of a scheme to prevent women from earning more money, and that men earn more money for the same work that women did, which it turned out. I wrote a book called Why Men Earn More and What Women Can Do About It, and it outlined 25 differences between what men and women do in their work-life balance. And if anybody should learn from anybody, men should learn from women that even though they earn less money for their work-life choices, they have happier lives as a rule. And that women should be teaching men how to have happier lives rather than men teaching women how to die in coal mines and volunteer to be in war and be disposable in that way. So I began to see things from both the women's and men's perspectives. And this happened as a result of the feminist movement, the National Organization for Women in New York City and other chapters around the country. Uh, they were um, they were debating whether to even allow men to be in the National Organization for Women. And they resolved their debate by saying, well, and the big reason was that once every month there were something called consciousness raising groups, which made women more aware of what was going on from a feminist perspective. And so when men attended those meetings, it intimidated the women. And so they wanted to, and that's really understandable. And so the final decision was that they would ask this Warren Farrell guy to sort of form some men's groups while the women were in the women's groups, and therefore, get the men out of the women's hair, if you will, and to see if that worked out. And so I agreed to do that, and it did work out. But the process of doing that, at first, since I was doing my doctoral dissertation on the women's movement, and I knew I was like a walking encyclopedia of everything the women's movement was saying, I would always give the guys at the end of the meeting a little, mini Warren Farrell lecture on the women's movement and the value of us all competing effectively to be the biggest jock in the sensitivity group, if you will. And but one day I decided to listen. And as I listened to group after group, I started seeing that man after man, when I asked a different question, which was, what was the dream that you had when you were younger? And it was usually to be a musician, an artist, a writer, elementary school teacher, doing something with passion. And I saw that especially the ones that were dads had usually given up their dreams, like to be a musician or an actor, and I remember one man in a men's groups who just loved kids, and he was an elementary school teacher. And he had, and his wife got pregnant, and he realized he couldn't, he couldn't move his family to a home in a neighborhood with an outstanding school at the salary that he was making, and his wife would no longer be able to work because of taking care of the children. And so that was his perspective. And so he felt that he needed to quit being an elementary school teacher. He hated administration and all the rigmarole with that. But nevertheless, he was willing to become a principal or a superintendent, and ultimately he became a superintendent of schools, but he hated it. But he made twice as much as he would have as an elementary school teacher. And so our perspective in the feminist movement was he earned more money than he did before, and he earned more money than most women. Therefore, he must have more power. But as I looked at it, I realized he had less power because real power is the ability to be a human being, not a human doing. And so that began to, and as I saw man after man giving up things that were his passion in order to do what he felt would lead to his children having more opportunities than he ever had, I began to see this very differently. And not as oppressors or oppressed, but and women having men having rights and women not, but I saw that historically our grandparents, they didn't have rights. They had responsibilities, they had obligations. Both sexes had obligations. Women had to risk their lives bearing children and spend much of their lives raising children. Men had to be to give up what they wanted to do the things that they needed to do. And when I started to write my first book, my father said to me, Warren, you cannot be an author. Uh, authors, only 1 out of 100 even get published, and the ones that get published make only about $5,000 a year at that time. And so you can't support a family on not getting publishers. And if you can't find a publisher, you'll never find a wife. And so that was his, way of looking at that. And that was, in general, the belief. And I was, fortunate enough to be able to get published and do well. And but it was that's 1 in 1,000 that are able to make a living, just from writing.
It, when you were recounting that story, that it seemed to me like men chose to give up their dreams, whereas women were stopped from pursuing them. So there's a kind of imbalance there.
Yes.
At least with men, they had a choice. Women were prohibited, but both suffered. History was hell for everybody. If you is kind
Well,
of
very good point. And so let me clarify there. So people's dreams are a certain percentage of women dream to be like CEOs or presidents of the United States. But as a rule, the more fulfilling an occupation is, the more it encompasses the likelihood of being somebody's dream. And in general, the more fulfilling an occupation is, the less it pays.
mm,
Because there's huge numbers of people competing to be fulfilled in relation to the supply is much greater than the demand. And so that's one of the reasons why, we call artists oftentimes starving artists. Picasso in his early career, or certainly Van Gogh, and many people, lived their entire lives, in Van Gogh's case, with only selling one painting to his brother.
mm.
And so, yeah, and so even when you're brilliant as an artist, oftentimes you're ahead of your time, and therefore your brilliance is not recognized in your early lifetime.
Yeah. You depart the feminist movement and move into thinking about men, thinking about what's happening to men, and you write The Myth of Male Power. You then go on to write The Boy Crisis. So, what is the boy crisis, and what was that transition like for you to make that leap?
The transition was wonderful and challenging. So the feminist perspective on me was, if I'm writing something like The Boy Crisis, boys will soon be men, and men have all the power, and they're the oppressors, and there's female privilege and I'm sorry, male privilege and male power, and so therefore you really must be a misogynist, because you're not paying attention to the resources going to women that we need, by suggesting that men also need resources and help, and need to have attention being paid to them as well. And so even though I was writing on boys, that type of perspective was often taken. On the other hand, even feminists who had boys as sons women have protective instincts toward their sons, but toward men, they still tend to this day to choose the provider protectors, or else not get married at all. So a woman who meets a man that she believes is going to earn less than her during her entire lifetime, she will sometimes live with him, but very rarely marry him. She has to perceive that sooner or later he'll get out of law school, he'll get out of medical school, he'll make a profit out of that business he's working on in the garage, and he'll do well. And so then she is much more open to marrying him.
Mm.
So my transition to paying attention to boys and men's issues was met with enormous hostility. So I went from going
Reputational damage.
Uh, Indeed. Just to pinpoint it that I went from doing about 50 speaking engagements per year, almost all recommended by feminists, down to between 0 and 1. And those were just leftover people that, that hadn't gotten the message that I was the wrong person now. And so the cost financially to me was, maybe $20 million. But so I had to deal with myself internally. Am I willing to give up that type of money, and the positive fame for a type of fame that was often negative, as well as positive, from other groups, and certainly live off a much smaller amount than I had been living on before.
$20 million is a lot of money. Did you anticipate losing on that scale?
A little bit, not quite to that degree, but I started hearing I was apparently a finalist for a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant type of thing, and then I began to, as I got people on the committee got word that I was no longer the sort of leading male feminist, but I was beginning to talk about boys and men's issues as well, and the importance of fathers in particular.
Mm,
And the importance of fathers is what alienated many feminists because as I mentioned this for the first time to the board of Now in New York City, it was met with silence. I talked about how the early research after the divorces in the 70s was showing that children that grew up without their dads did much worse, both boys and girls, than children who grew up with their dads and their moms both in the home. And I remember to this day, I remember the entire board just becoming silent. And finally, one woman was sweet enough to say, Warren, you realize that many of our now our feminine are paying membership, they care about when there's a divorce, them being able to move out of state with a new guy and to drop their past and they usually choose men that are really good for the child. And so that's the choices that we want to make. If we're saying to women that men should have equal rights to the children after divorce, we're going to lose a lot of membership, and we have a lot of things to handle in feminist causes. It's not just child custody. So, Warren, you admitted yourself, Warren, that the research was new on this because it was the 70s and we didn't have 10, 20-year longitudinal studies about how well these children would do. So maybe these children will suffer for a year or two or three, but they won't suffer over the course of a lifetime. So, somewhat condescendingly, they said, so why don't you sort of do some more research before you, basically give up your career and give up our recommendations from all of us? And so I did do more research, and the more research I did, the more I found that, that boys and girls that have minimal father involvement, that are what I call dad deprived, that those boys and girls are likely to do less well on more than 70 different metrics, from being able to do well on reading and writing and math and science, to being able to graduate from high school to begin with, being much more likely to be failures to launch, being much more likely to drop out of high school, have lower grades, not be in honor societies. And the boys that dropped out of high school, more than 20% of them are unemployed in their 20s, and therefore their eligibility for female love was much less. They were less likely to be employed. They were far more likely to live in their parents' basements, or go back home and live with their parents. And women who are looking for future fathers or future husbands that will be fathers very rarely search for unemployment lines and parents' basements for candidates. And if he's tall and good looking, they may be fine about having sex with him, but not for marriage and not for having children. And so these were some of the transitions that I went through as I
mm,
started to see all the degree to which dad deprived children were also, more likely to be drug addicts, more likely to be addicted to video games, more likely to die from overdoses. And it's being without a dad or dad deprived, what I call dad deprived, is because nobody's without a dad. So that's why I use the term dad deprived. And is that dad deprived children are the single biggest predictor of males committing suicide. Now, almost all the disadvantages, the 70 metrics that I mentioned, are also true for daughters as well. There are some that are true much more for daughters. So, for example, daughters that don't have father involvement often don't know how to please a man except by being sexual, because they don't have the nuances of all the interactions with a man that is not sexual with them, and so therefore they feel oftentimes on dates that either they have that the way to keep a man is to be sexual, even when they're not comfortable being sexual. And that's very sad. And then alternatively, they are so afraid of not knowing what to do with a man that they don't get into relationships to begin with. And so women who have children without being married as teenagers are far more likely to be raised by without dad involvement. But other than that, most of the challenges that both girls and boys suffer, like being less motivated, feeling abandoned, and so on, they are suffered by both girls and boys, just more intensely by boys. And part of the reason for that is that a girl at least has a role model of a female and her mother. And girls have much more permission to cry and say what's upsetting them. And they feel much more able to talk about, mommy, I'm bleeding down there. What's that about? I'm absolutely, freaked out. And the mom can talk about her experience, etc. Where it's much harder for a boy to go up to mom and say, I'm feeling like I'm doing something in the bathtub, and something's coming out. What's that about, mom? That's not a normal question that men feel free to, young men feel free to ask to talk to their mom about.
Well, you've also identified a scientific biological correlation to do with telomeres, shortened telomeres, and dad deprivation, right?
Yes, and when I did the research for the boy crisis, one of the things that really astonished, a lot of things astonished me, including the whole formation of a dad brain, which I'll talk about if you'd like. But
Yes.
one of them was the impact on telomeres. So when a boy and girl are 9.5 years of age, a study was done with a control group that had a lot of father involvement and a control group that didn't. And they found that the control group without father involvement at the age of 9.5 had telomeres that were 14% shorter than those that had father involvement. Now, telomeres are, a tiny part of your cell. And the longer the telomeres are when you're about 9.5 years of age, the more likely you are to live longer. They're the single biggest predictor of the length of your life. And so both girls and boys without dad involvement had telomeres that were 14% shorter, but the boys' telomeres were then again 40% shorter than the girls. And so you get some sense of the impact of father involvement on both boys and girls, but the greater disproportionate impact of lack of father involvement on boys. And another thing like that was really astonishing that I made a reference to a minute ago is we often think of women having a motherhood instinct, and they do. And when the hormones change, women when a woman is pregnant, the woman begins to change priorities and many other things. Clearly, that's true. But what I didn't know was, until I did the research for the boy crisis, is that the boys, that young men, if they start taking an interest in the children and start touching the mother's belly, and feeling the child inside the embryo inside the womb, that their brain changes, that there's a whole nest of neurons that are not connected when there's no interest in the child. But if there's interest in the child being born, those neurons start firing and connect a sort of second brain that is right below the mother instinct brain of neurons and hormone that the hormones activate. And so, and that brain has differences to the female brain. Men, and I think the biggest single discovery for me in doing the research for the boy crisis was finding that dads and moms have very different parenting styles. And so the dad brain develops an equivalent of the female instinct brain, but with different types of priorities and motivations. So, for example, a dad is far more likely to roughhouse with his children than a mom is. Some moms do roughhouse and some dads don't. But as a rule, dads are far more likely to roughhouse. And no one knew what all the benefits of roughhousing were, or what all the benefits of teasing are that dads are likely to do more than moms. And I never, in the Boy Crisis book, I never blame this on moms not knowing, because moms can't hear what dads don't say. And conversely, I don't blame dads, because the reason I included that research in the Boy Crisis book was because I saw that no book I had read and no magazine I had read ever talked about these differences. And so moms would often feel like, dads, let's say that mom and dad are divorced. And it's the quote visitation, a terrible word, but what they call visitation weekend for the dad. And so, and the dad takes the kid to a playground on the weekend. And then maybe the kid is 8, 9 years of age and leaves the boy, let's say the boy at the playground. And but in the process of leaving him there, the boy gets into a fight on the playground and comes home, with evidence of that fight, a black eye or whatever. And if the mom is about to pick that boy up and take that boy back, the dad doesn't have a chance to process with the boy. What were the red flags that you saw that told you that there was a kid drinking, or there was that basketball practice was really fouling practice, and the big kids were pushing the little kids around? How could you have gotten out of that situation without getting into a fight? What could you have done? That's what dads tend to do, things like let the children be on their own, but then when something happens that's bad, to talk about using that life experience to prevent that life experience from repeating itself. Moms will tend to be more likely to stay on the playground and watch the child. And if something looks like it's brewing, the mom will probably sense it and pull the child out of that situation to begin with. Now, both of those parenting styles have value, but the dad's perspective is that that I want to be able to teach my child how to protect myself before he leaves home, so he doesn't get protected, and then leave home and enter a world where he's not protected. But the mom's perspective on that might be that the mom says to the boy, where was your dad? And the boy said, "Oh, your dad went home." And "Oh, why did he go home?" "Well, there were playoffs tonight." Mom calculates dad more interested in the playoffs than he is in the son. And this is why I can't leave. This is why I can't leave my son or my daughter with the dad. And so that becomes a justifiable experience for her, as to and with a good heart and a protective heart, that she shouldn't encourage more time with the dad.
So there's a lack of understanding in how men parent, um, that can create some kind of resentment, or perhaps concern around how the father is parenting, which then can create a rift in the relationship, perhaps.
Correct. And dads themselves don't even know. I mean,
Mm.
so I'm not blaming the moms here. Neither mom nor dad understands that the 7 major differences in parenting styles that I talk about in the Boy Crisis book, that all of those have positive values for the children. How many dads have I known that haven't read the book, that are able to explain to the moms, I want to roughhouse with the child, because more roughhousing with the children will help them develop empathy. The mom would look at him and say, "Wait a minute, You're saying roughhousing is going to help my daughter and son have more empathy? That's like the most counterintuitive statement I could ever imagine. Well, and it also helps the children have more postponed gratification. Huh? Seems to me like they're all knocking each other around and somebody's going to get hurt.
Mhm.
And so dads don't know that empathy, postponed gratification are highly connected with roughhousing, and they can't explain it if they don't know it. And so I don't blame moms for not knowing it. And as I said, it's not available for dads. And so this was what inspired me to do the research for the boy crisis. The more that I heard about what the actual connection was between roughhousing, empathy, roughhousing, and postponed gratification, and a half dozen other positive things. The more and also roughhousing and boundary enforcement and how
I
important
was,
that is.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you have noted a difference in how men and women enforce boundaries and create boundaries. I think you've referenced the fact that both men and women create boundaries. It's just that men enforce them. Is that a correct characterization of your?
yes, women as a rule set more boundaries, and men as a rule enforce boundaries more. So, for example, studies of boys and girls, children under dad's supervision and mom's supervision find that moms will set the bedtime earlier than dad. So let's say mom sets the bedtime at 8:30, dad sets the bedtime at 9. But that under dad's supervision, the children actually get to bed earlier than under mom's supervision. So how does that work? So for example, the children at 8:30 at bedtime that the mom has set might come up to mom and say something like, Mom, I can't go to bed now because I haven't even finished my homework and I don't want to go into school with my homework not finished. And mom goes, oh my God, I don't want you to go into school with homework not finished either. But you were playing some video games before, sweetie, and and you should have been doing homework instead. But nevertheless, you're right. I don't want you to go into school without your homework being done. And so then the child does the homework and maybe takes another half hour to do that. And then at the end of the half hour says, oh boy, I finished the homework now, Mom. Can you read to me? Because, I finished my homework. And mom thinks, well, I do want to reward the child for finishing the homework. And so, and then the mom feels really good after maybe she reads a story or two to the child that she is enforcing boundaries by saying maybe an hour later, no, I've already given you a couple of stories. Now it's bedtime. But what's happened in that last hour is that the child has learned that it can manipulate the mom to extending that bedtime from 8:30 to say ultimately 9:30. Dad is more likely to do that type of behavior the first time, but once he gives a warning about you need to finish your homework instead of talking to somebody on the phone, or instead of playing a video game, or instead of looking at your iPhone. And if you don't do that, then you're going to go into school with your homework not finished. And yes, you'll get a D or an F. And yes, that's your responsibility. If you want to live your life as a loser, that's your choice. But you're not going to manipulate me into making the bedtime past 9 o'clock. And from a mom's perspective, that's sort of like cruel. You're going to have that child go into school without being able to finish with the homework unfinished. That's going to give them a bad attitude towards school and so on. And there's an argument there. But that's a significant difference between a dad style parent, or example of a significant difference between dad style parenting and mom style parenting is, and the importance of boundaries being enforced is that when boundaries are enforced, children learn to not manipulate because they can't manipulate. So children where boundaries are set, and then the child is able to manipulate the mother into, or a father that doesn't enforce boundaries, into a later bedtime, and the set boundaries mean nothing. That tends to enhance disrespect on the part of the child toward the parent. What the parent says is meaningless. I know how to manipulate the parent now better, and I have more energy than the parent. So sooner or later, I'll wear mom out. And moms, devoted and caring and working, to do the best with, and all that love gets misused by that child, because children who do better almost always have parents that enforce the boundaries, even though they argue and and yell again for a while. But it's amazing. The good news is it's amazing how fast, when boundaries are enforced consistently, that children adapt, because women, the parents have a lot more leverage than many parents know that they have.
Um, according to One Family in Ireland, it's a national organization for one-parent families. 1 in 4 families in Ireland is a one-parent family right now. 86.4% headed by mother, 13.6% by father. Um, are those numbers, are they resonating with you? Are they similar to US numbers? I would imagine it's slightly more in the United States in terms of mother-led homes, is it?
It is. There are two. Yes, you're doing well compared to us. And
Yeah.
so we have two sources of mother headed homes. One is from divorce, and divorce rate is more around the 50% level here. And then oftentimes when there's a divorce, the the mom has the right to the children, and the dad has to fight for children. And the problem with that is the only dads that can afford to fight for children are dads that are usually pretty successful, that can afford lawyers and expert witnesses and so on. And oftentimes those dads actually have less time with the children. The dads have more time to be with the children are often earning less money and can't afford to fight for them. And so it's a real lose-lose situation. I say lose-lose, it's really lose-lose-lose. The people that lose are the children, most importantly, the father, and then also a mother. The lack of father involvement is a woman's issue. Women that I dated between, I've been with my wife for 30 years now, but after an 11-year marriage, and I had a period of singleness, and during those single years, most women I dated had children, and every single one of the women with children that I dated used the word overwhelmed. She often felt like she couldn't do her job well, and she couldn't do her raising of children well. She was exhausted, depleted. This is Moms need dads, because it's too exhausting an experience to raise children by yourself, especially if you're having to work as well, and that is the case. So we have a much higher rate of children being dad deprived because of the divorce rate. Now, in terms of mothers having children without being married, 40% of women today who have children without being married in the United States. That's a huge percentage. Now, some of them live with their father as opposed to being married, but men and women who live together when there's a child born, that relationship lasts on average only 3.5 years. So you can imagine the children begin to attach to the father, and then they suddenly get abandoned by the father. So from their perspective, when in fact, often from the father's perspective, he wants to be involved more with the children, but the divorce is making the mother feel that she wants to move on, and the dad is oftentimes given very minimal amount of parenting time, especially if they're not married. Oftentimes given no parenting time. So we have a bigger problem proportionally of dad deprived children in the United States, but you obviously have a significant amount of that also.
It's a growing one. Do you think there are incentives in place? I want to ask you if there's a racial and class issue here as well. But first, I want to ask you in terms of what the government and the legislature are doing. Are there incentives in place, at least in the United States, that encourage people to end marriages? What are your thoughts on incentives?
Yes, well, you're referring to government incentives. but I'd like to suggest something that really could help marriages not end to begin with. So um, as I started doing all the work in this area, I began to see that that marriages often fell apart because when somebody had a concern, they would express it to their partner, and the partner would experience it as criticism. And I started to see that the Achilles heel of all human beings is our inability to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive. And so I started to ask myself, was there any way that I could get people to be able to hear personal criticism without becoming defensive? And it took me years to develop a program where I could do that. And basically, what I work with couples in my workshops to do. I do a workshop called Role Mate to Soulmate, and I finally have a book coming out on that in a few weeks. And in the Role Mate to Soulmate workshops, what I do is to have people before they hear their partner's criticism to meditate into an altered state, because it's biologically natural to be defensive in response to criticism, because historically, if you heard criticism, it was from a neighboring territory, it was a potential enemy. And it made sense, in order to survive, to get up your defenses so you weren't killed by the enemy. So it was perfectly natural for survival. It's just perfectly dysfunctional for love. And so I started asking myself, all right, I knew, since it was natural for survival, that I wasn't going to be able to change things like that, like make this evolutionary shift. But I did figure out that I could get couples to set aside one period of time during the week, which I called a caring and sharing time, to have one concern that they expressed to their partner, but to know that before they express that concern, their partner would meditate into an altered state in which their partner would learn that if they provided a safe environment for their partner's concerns, even if their partner's concerns were exaggerated, even if they were lies, even if they were said in an angry tone of voice, if they could provide a safe environment for that, that their partner would feel safer and therefore more loved, and have therefore more love for them. So in a way, the worse their partner behaved in giving the criticism, or the more inaccurate it was, that partner would be experiencing this enormous safety that she or he did not expect, and therefore this enormous gratitude for just letting him or her be heard without being judged in the process of doing that. Now, the process is more complex than that, but that's just so one of the 6 mindsets that I have the person who's about to listen to the criticism say out loud, so that the person about to criticize realizes that the person, their husband or their wife, is preparing themselves to feel safe and to feel this connection of permission for them to give whatever, to have them say whatever they want. So that's is what I call the love guarantee, and the love guarantee is very much like what I just explained. I then do 5 other workshop experiences in which, and by the end of that time of meditating into the 6 mindsets, if the person who is about to listen to the criticism feels very secure inside, they give their partner permission to share the criticism. The moment they lose that ability to feel safe inside, they say the word hold, and they recenter themselves until they feel safe again to be able to hear more of the criticism. And so that's just a little tip of the iceberg. And so and the reason I was using that as a response is that the best way to avoid the boy crisis and the lack of father involvement is to have the boy and the girl be able to see a mom and dad having differences, being able to work them through, hear each other out, listen to each other's, making each other feel heard. And then the parents don't get divorced to begin with. They know that every challenge they have can be discussed through and they can be heard about that. The kids pick up that role modeling. And instead of having a divorce that is a predictor of the children being divorced, they have parents that work out differences. They see how they work them out. They can do that with their friends at school, their new girlfriend or boyfriend when they get to be that age, and ultimately in their marriage. And they have much more secure marriages and much more happy relationships and a lot more happiness in life.
That's a strategy for couples that would help maintain and cultivate a good long-term relationship and resolve disputes, right? And it's
Yeah.
and that book is coming out in a few weeks, and it's a fantastic model. But we do have inevitably divorces, and I wanted to ask you about. You were invited by the Obama administration, I think, if I remember this correctly, to participate or get involved in workshops or to think about how the government and the country could work with girls, and you insisted that boys would be part of the conversation, right? What were you thinking in terms of recommendations and strategies, and what are you thinking now in terms of recommendations and strategies?
Yes, when President Obama first got elected, he was going to form an advisor. He formed a White House Council for women and girls only.
Mm,
And so because I had my background with now, somebody called me and said, "Can you be on the advisory board for that?" They ended up never forming the advisory board, but at any rate, I said yes, of course. But that there was also a need for a White House Council on Boys and Men or a White House Council, a White House Gender Policy Council. President Biden does have a White House Gender Policy Council, but it explicitly is only for girls and women, which is just the absolute most hypocritical thing that you could possibly imagine. But anyway, I said, so the woman who was asking me to be on the advisory board said, well, I don't have enough power or permission to create this White House Council on Boys and Men, but why don't you do a proposal for it? And then we'll submit it to the president. And we did a proposal for it. I got about 30 of the best thinkers on these issues together. We created a proposal for it. It's the proposals on the, if you do White House Council Boys and Men, there's the proposals there. But the proposal is very much articulated in the Boy Crisis book, I think, in a much deeper way. And so I did that. And then the Boy Scouts gave it official approval, and they sent one of their Eagle Scouts. They have meetings once a year with the president. So they sent one of their Eagle Scouts to present this to President Obama. And so and when they were about to, just before they went into the room, Valerie Jarrett, the chief advisor to President Obama, crossed that agenda item off the list and said, "Oh, that's the wrong time and wrong place for it." But she never, but when we approached her and said, "Well, what's the right time and the right place?" Her response was that, that men have all the power already. Why are you taking these few minimal resources that women and girls have away from them and trying to divide it and give it to boys as well? And of course, missing the point completely, and obviously never having read the proposal or just ignoring it basically in spirit. And so
yeah.
that was deeply disappointing to say the least.
You've made the point that you've built this kind of adversarial relationship. Can you see do you think that's dissipating? Can you see any way of mending that kind of adversarial thing between men and women right now? Or is it just,
I can see a way of mending it, and I hope my whole life has been about trying to make that change. And yeah, I basically say when only one sex wins, both sexes lose. And fortunately, the boy crisis did inspire legislation in places like Florida, which were voted for, by the way, by every single Republican and every single Democrat, which in the United States in the House of Representatives in Florida.
it's crazy, yeah.
Among the things that happened from that is that they contributed $70 million to develop to develop programs to help fathers understand why we as dads are so needed in the ways that I was talking about before. What do we do that's different, complementary? And then how do we communicate effectively about it to the other gender parent? And so that is, and so that's out there, hopefully at work now. The fact that every Republican and every Democrat in the House voted for it tells me that even Democrats tend to not value the family and the importance of fathers as much as they value women's rights to be able to do what they want to do after divorce, and often feel the nuclear family as an institution of oppression and the patriarchy, whereas Republicans tend to feel that the nuclear family is vital to
Sacred.
children doing optimal.
Mm.
And understand, that I am more politically liberal and Democrat than I am Republican, but I've been much more embraced by Republicans because I understand that when it comes to the value of the family and the value of the father, the Republicans in the United States are much, much more on target about what is a value than the Democrats at this point in history are.
You've noted the correlation between gun violence and mass shootings as well, and boys, and they come from fatherless homes. If you were, what would your message be to an angry, isolated, depressed boy of 12 or 13 years of age? He's living in Galway or he's living in Wisconsin, and he happens to stumble upon this video. What would you
I
like to say to
Well,
him?
first, if there's any way that he can be reconnected, I mean, if he has his biological dad with him, he's probably not depressed and not suicidal and so on. But if he doesn't have his biological dad with him, is to really read through the boy crisis book and explain in a loving and caring way to his mom some of the reasons why it's so important for him to have his dad in his life, while making it clear to his mom how much he loves her, and how much he appreciates the work she does and the sacrifices she makes. And the mom, and ask the mom to read through so that moms don't understand the value of dads. They don't understand that roughhousing leads to empathy, or why it does. It just doesn't compute. And so most moms want their children the best for their children. And so when they realize that the best for their children is a dad and mom both contributing, and in what I call checks and balance parenting. That is, the dad explaining what he's contributing to, and why it's so important for the boy or the girl to be able to climb that tree in the backyard, and mom to be able to say, well, all right, I don't think the child should be climbing the tree at this young age. But on the other hand, if they do, you got to be out there under the tree in case they fall, and you got to promise me they won't go up beyond this level where the branches are too thin, and you got to give me the cell phone so you won't be distracted, so you can concentrate. And then the child gets the best of both worlds. The child gets the protection that mom tends to offer, and gets the ability to develop a higher IQ and make the decisions that allow the child to know what risks are worth taking and what risks aren't. Now, I've never heard a dad say, when a child climbs a tree, his or her IQ increases, because they don't understand that that neurons fire, that are different, and IQs increase because the child is constantly making decisions out of its comfort zone, which fires different neurons and so on, and begins to train itself to be able to assess what is
Risk as well, to
risk,
calculate risk.
exactly what risks are worth taking and what
Mm.
risks are not worth taking. And at the same time, when a kid is, a kid, and you don't want that to be learned if he happens to not fall and kill himself, you want that to be learned within the framework of not having a serious concussion or killing oneself.
What does the future hold for Dr. Warren Farrell on your 81st birthday?
Yes, this is my 81st birthday.
Congratulations.
And let's see. Oh, I hope to live out the day.
So I hope
And
you do too.
thank you. And the my next steps is I really care a great deal about the Role Mate to Soulmate book, and I've done I've put a few packages together. One is that I realize that when people read a book, they can get a great deal of insight, but they actually have to sort of practice it with their partner. So I've also produced an online video course that I was making available for just a couple of $100 so that almost anybody could afford it. But I so much wanted it to be something that people used even more than the book, that I allowed it to be to be a QR code in the appendix of the book that people could use who bought the book and get the video course for less than half price. And so it's actually cheaper to get the video course and the book together than it is to get the book alone. But that still leaves some people in the country without and throughout the world without the ability to afford, even $97 for for a video course online. And so I'm trying to work on creating a foundation to be able to distribute that online video to all the poor communities in the United States and ultimately have it translated into different languages and have that happen throughout the world. And so that's sort of and then I also have a book contract to take the Myth of Male Power book and to make a new book out of that. And I will be updating that, and it'll be called The Paradox of Male Power. And that will be my next project. And hopefully I'll live long enough to complete those things and see them do some good in the world.
That's incredible. You're making me think. You're making me. I gotta get my act together. That's a
You
lot of
have your
work. That's a
act
lot of
together.
work ahead of you. That's a lot of work. And yeah, I wish you every success with that, Warren.
Thank
It's an
you.
incredible legacy that you're building for communities, for societies, and for the world. I want to thank you so much for everything that you've done.
Thank you for helping me communicate this and to asking questions that are really thoughtful, having read the book and done your homework, and then listening really well. You are making in that an enormous contribution yourself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warren Farrell. Thank you.